Hello, listeners. I am thrilled to have my dear friend and colleague, Emily Strong of the Amazing Pet Harmony, back on the show today. So, welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited of the topic we're going to be talking about. So, speaking of that, today we're going to be talking about a necessary and possibly underutilized skill for all behavior consultants to exercise and teach their clients. And it's called, it's not how to
Critical
hold
thinking skills.
critical thinking skills. And critical thinking is defined as the objective analysis and evaluation of an issue in order to form a judgment. I'm not loving that word judgment, but you get where we're going. Or another definition is critical thinking is the analysis of an issue or situation and the facts, data, or evidence that's related to it. And so it's really meant to be done objectively, which can sometimes be really hard, given how much we care about what we do. And so objectively really means to be without influence from our personal feelings, opinions, or biases. So we're trying to focus solely on the factual information. So now that we've laid that foundation, Emily, I'd love for you to talk to us a little bit more, like tease that out in terms of like what critical thinking skills actually are. Because when I think about it, it's like, yeah, like base my next steps on the facts, but there's a lot that goes into critical thinking skills. And so I'd love for you to just chat with us a little bit about what those elements are.
Yeah. I like when I'm visualizing critical thinking skills, I think of it like a pyramid. Like there's kind of 3 points to critical thinking that are all on a really important foundation. So the 3 areas of critical thinking skills are being able to identify logical fallacies, which are errors in reasoning. All right. So we make decisions based on our reasoning, and we can have errors in our reasoning that leads us to faulty conclusions or faulty assessments. By the way, I want to say the word judgment when we're talking about critical thinking, the word judgment isn't like judging people. It's another word for like assessment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when we're assessing a situation, logical fallacies are when we make errors in our reasoning, which then, influences our conclusion, right? So
Mm-hmm.
think of that judgment as like a conclusion. The second pillar of critical thinking skills are being able to recognize cognitive biases, and cognitive biases are errors in perception. So how we're seeing the world and how we're interpreting what we're seeing. And that is obviously very important because as important as it is to try to be objective, we can't escape who we are, our past learning experiences,
Yep.
our emotional responses to things. And so being aware of those and normalizing them is super important and healthy, because when we're aware that like our emotions are valid, and also sometimes they get in the way of us seeing a situation clearly, then it's easier to process that without feelings of like shame or embarrassment or judging yourself or whatever, right?
Yep.
And then the third pillar of critical thinking is a big, long, scary word that I have been told by many people feels overwhelming. So I acknowledge that this is a scary word, but it makes a lot of sense when you learn about it. It's called epistemology. And epistemology just means how do we know what we know, right? So epistemology is assessing the quality of the information we're receiving. So those are the 3 pillars of critical thinking: identifying logical fallacies, identifying cognitive biases, and epistemology. But I think all of those rest on a foundation of another scary word, metacognition. And metacognition means the ability to observe your own thought processes and emotional responses,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the reason I think metacognitive skills are an important foundation or base to those 3 kind of critical thinking pillars is because if you just learn about some logical fallacies and cognitive biases without learning self-reflection, it's really easy to like go out into the world and be a jerk to other people and be like, that's a such and such fallacy and that's a whatever, without having any awareness of like what you're actually doing and why you're reacting that way. And we see that a lot in people who are just starting to learn about critical thinking skills, that they're using it as a weapon rather than using it as a method of self-improvement and as a way of assessing the information they're receiving, to be more conscientious and mindful of what the information that they're consuming, right? So I think that metacognition is really important, because you can't, being a human, you can't escape logical fallacies and cognitive biases. They are part and parcel of being human. And it is so hard to acknowledge that and to identify when we're kind of falling for those errors. And a lot of times we're so invested in what we believe that there's a lot of emotions that are attached to that. And if we are unable to kind of scale back and observe our own behavior and emotional responses and process that, that can lead to an abuse of the critical thinking process instead of using it in a healthy way that fosters growth, right?
Mm-hmm. I love that. Thank you for explaining all those scary words in just really concise and easy for people to digest. When you said something about, well, first I want to say, like, thank you for saying that those two first pillars, like, we can't escape them, right? Like, we're human beings, and that, like, we are going to bring our previous learning experiences into the current present, right? And that the self-awareness or the metacognition is so critical to not only like experience, like, oh wow, it's happening, I'm bringing previous experiences into this experience and I'm not sure they're relevant, and instead of like sending myself down a shame spiral of like, oh, I don't know anything, like, look at me, I'm bringing previous experiences into this experience, like I'm doing the thing again, right? It's just to say, like, let's normalize it. We're going to be, we are humans, we are capable of like making mistakes all the time. And so just being aware of that and not using it like as a weapon towards ourselves. I love that you're bringing that up. Right. And that learning is, one time I asked a colleague of ours, Mara, I said, there's a word, like, is there a word to define that learning is uncomfortable? Like, because a lot of my clients were saying, like, man, like I'm loving all the things you're teaching me. And then all of a sudden I'm all of a sudden feeling really uncomfortable. And I'm like, it's not cognitive dissonance, and she was just like, no, learning's uncomfortable. So, and I was like, you sure there isn't like a scientific term for that? And she's like, no, I think it's just like learning can be uncomfortable. It really does. It does force us to be, I'll use a Kathy Sadeo word, like wiggly and think beyond what we currently know, which is really exciting, but it can also be really confronting at times.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I think that's one thing that the kind of positive reinforcement or humane training community, whatever you want to call us, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one thing that I'm starting to see a trend towards, this idea of like, because we're into humane training or positive reinforcement, no one should ever feel any discomfort. So if it feels icky, I'm not going to engage in it because it's aversive, right? And that's not actually beneficial, that's not actually healthy, and that's not actually what the behavior sciences have shown us, right? The point of humane training is that we are not intentionally adding an aversive to our training so that later we can take it away. That is damaging for a lot of reasons. It's damaging to the relationship, and we won't get into the training philosophy because that's not why we're here. But the point of humane training is that there are aversives everywhere in our environment, in our world, and many of them are inescapable. And if we teach through skill building and this constructive approach of like making sure that we have this good learning environment and safe space and all of that, it empowers our learners to process the discomfort that just comes naturally in the environment that just exists in the world. in a way that is resilient and healthy and confident and constructive, right? And so this idea that like I shouldn't have to engage in something because it's icky, because I believe in positive reinforcement, is a misunderstanding of the whole purpose of it, right? And the reality is learning is unavoidably uncomfortable. It doesn't always have to be. Yes, we can gamify things and make things fun, but especially when we're talking about this higher order learning of like critical thinking skills, where we're having to confront our own emotional attachments to things and our own misperceptions, that just is uncomfortable. We can't, there's no way to gamify confronting your own baggage, right?
Yep.
Like, I mean, maybe there is, right?
Maybe there is. I don't know it.
Right. Maybe someday somebody will figure out how to gamify therapy, but like that we're not there right now. We don't have a way to do that. So I think that's one of the things that as a community we need to learn how to embrace, is that we shouldn't avoid things that are uncomfortable, like challenging our own, cognitive biases and logical fallacies. We should just learn how to do it in a way that is constructive and safe, and we've normalized it. Like, hey, we're all here, we all do this, let's look at it together, let's poke fun at ourselves, let's laugh at ourselves. This just happened to me yesterday, where a friend of mine showed me a study, and I went into like all the different reasons. I wasn't like bashing the study, I was like, I can see how this information is important, but here are all the things that I'm concerned, like I think they need to keep going because I think they're making some assumptions. And then at the end I realized my basic premise for interpreting that study was flawed. I was like, okay, I just realized that I was talking about something completely different that the study wasn't talking about. So never mind. Like that was my own logical fallacy, right? And we laughed about it. And like we all like had a good laugh about the fact that I had this like logical fallacy where I had just it was like a flawed premise. I went into it. It was a false equivalence that I had made. And we had a good laugh about it and moved on, right?
Yeah.
So like, yes, it's uncomfortable. It was uncomfortable to read that study and have it deeply conflict with things that I already knew, but that doesn't mean it was bad. It meant that I had to engage with it to keep learning and recognize where I had fallen for a logical fallacy, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think in our profession, I mean, you guys at Pet Harmony are doing an amazing job of creating community and mentorship. And like, if anyone hasn't checked out their programs or their enrichment framework class, which was amazing, like I send all newbies to you guys, because it's like, you guys are creating such a wonderful community. Because one of the points, the reason why I bring that up is because I feel like it's a really scary world to step into being a trainer and behavior consultant, because you go through these programs and a lot of them are online, and you engage with people online in that way, or you are in person for KPA weekends where you're engaging with your classmates, but it's still really, it's so damn isolating, right? And so and then it's really hard to like step up in front of somebody, especially in like an online community, and say something and be wrong, and then receive that feedback. And then everybody in our industry not everybody, people in our industry can be a little bit grumpy or aversive to those folks that are learning and in that process. So it almost feels dangerous to be so vulnerable in our profession at times, because like someone might misinterpret what you say or whatever. So my heart goes out to people that are brand new in the profession. Like my client is now newer in the profession. She did the KPA and she's incredible, and she's a lawyer. And she was like, whoa, this behavior profession is like cutthroat. Like everybody is like going after one another. Like she's like, I've never seen anything like this, and I'm a stinking lawyer. And I'm like, yeah, that's kind of sad to me, right? Like that's your experience. But so I do think it's a skill we need to have, and I want to honor if folks are listening and are like, yeah, but it's really scary for me to like say I'm wrong or ask a question, because our profession doesn't there are some great communities, and then there are other times where it's isolating, it's scary to be on one's own. And so,
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
just want to
And
honor
I think
that.
I would add to that too, that the other thing that makes it so scary is that our profession is kind of the Wild West, right?
Totally.
There's no regulations, there's no clear path. There are degree programs that you can get degrees, but the knowledge and skills you gain in degree programs don't perfectly align with the knowledge and skills that you need to be a behavior consultant,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so even people, I mean, I have people in the mentorship program who have advanced degrees in one of the behavior sciences, and they're still in the mentorship program because they realized that
Mm,
college did not prepare them for actually being in this field, right?
yeah,
And so even if you go like a more traditional academic path, it's still, you get out and you find out it's still the Wild West, and
totally.
there's still not a clear path to learning how to become a behavior consultant. There are more paths to becoming a trainer, kind of,
Kind of.
but kind of
Mm-hmm.
but the reason epistemology is such an important and kind of missing skill in this field is because, since it is an unregulated field, there is so much garbage and misinformation and pseudoscience that dresses itself up as like new fancy science. And how do you, as a new person, or even as a person who's been in the field for a long time, filter through that and figure out what's the best route to take to really learn solid knowledge and skills, and the set of knowledge and skills that you need to be effective in this profession,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's where epistemology comes in, because if you have those critical thinking skills and you can identify logical fallacies and cognitive biases, and you are really good at epistemology and assessing the information that you're receiving, you can become a more savvy consumer of that information and pick better learning opportunities that are going to not kind of lead you down a path of like incorrect or incomplete information,
Yeah.
right? So that, I think, is why critical thinking skills are extra. I mean, I think they're important everywhere all the time. I think our world would be a better place if this was taught in school.
Mm-hmm.
um, but I think it's extra important in our field for that reason, right?
So what would be an example of epistemology? Like, is that like learning how to read a research paper so that you can make a critical thinking decision about what you're reading versus just like consuming it and reading it as Bible? Would
That,
that be an
well, yeah,
example of it?
that is an example of kind of. I want to refine what you just said.
Okay.
So I think lay people, non-academic people, and I'm one of them, so I'm not speaking from this, on high. I'm saying like, hey, we as a group tend to think of research in a binary, like it's either valid or it isn't.
Mm,
And I think we have this thing that happens. There's like a cherry picking logical fallacy where we tend to pick the things that we like and discard things that we don't like, regardless of their validity. And there's also a cognitive bias called confirmation bias, where we tend to select things that support what we believe and discard things that don't, right? So, yes, being able to critically assess research does not mean assessing whether or not it's valid, because that's not really how research works, right?
mm,
So what really the function of, so for example, the study that I was looking at yesterday, a lot of really important information. I read their process of how they came to their conclusions. It was actually a meta-analysis, so they looked at lots of different papers. I looked at what they were including and excluding, and what their criteria were for inclusion or exclusion. And it was all great information, but there was um, one part of the study where they were kind of leaping to a conclusion or making an assumption that they hadn't actually proven, right? So my own logical fallacy aside, where I was making a false equivalence, that was me, that was my bad. But what I took away from that study was not, this is a garbage study, I don't have to listen to it because of this one faulty assumption, right? what I took away from that is this is awesome information. This is really good to think about. It makes a very, as research does, and research doesn't make broad claims. It makes very specific claims about the very specific context they were looking at. And they need to do further research to challenge that one assumption in the paper, because that assumption we don't actually know is true. And I actually couldn't find any research in support of that assumption. That doesn't mean that the research is not out there. I spent maybe an hour on this, so I wasn't like, I definitely don't have the same depth of knowledge that the researchers have about their own topic, right? But my conclusion was, this is really good information. I'm going to file this away in the back of my head, and I would love to see them. The next thing that they study is challenging that assumption to see that if it's actually true, right? So it's not a baby in the bathwater thing where you're either embracing research or discarding it. It's being able to read the paper and look at their methodology and say, they're not making these big claims, which is something that happens, right? A paper will come out and then somebody writes an article about it that jumps to these huge leaps of logic that the research doesn't actually say. And then everybody gets all up in arms about, this overstatement that happens. So being able to identify what the paper is actually saying and how they got there and what parts of that needs further study, that's an example of how you could use epistemology. Another more practical example for people who don't love like digging through research like I do, but more like a more practical, like on the ground thing is, if you're looking at a book or a course or a webinar and people are making claims in this book or course or webinar, going, how do you know that? Okay, so you just gave me this information. You're making that this is your position. How did you come to that conclusion? Can you cite your sources? Can you show your work? Like, talk me through how you got here. Instead of just being like, that sounds so good. Like, this is so appealing.
Or like that confirms what I believe. Perfect. Yeah.
Right. So if you're going to get on a platform and charge people money or not charge people money to give them information, I think people are likely to just sort of swallow it because you're perceived as an expert. That, by the way, is a logical fallacy called the appeal to authority. We believe it because an expert says it. And so epistemology helps people avoid that appeal to authority logical fallacy and go, how do you know that? How did you come to these conclusions? Can you cite your sources, show your work? Are you who you claim to be? All of those things, right? So if you can do that, then you can assess whether or not this is a reliable learning resource, right?
Yeah.
So that's a more practical boots on the ground use of epistemology.
Yeah. I love that example. And I love, another question I had for you is like, how do we know when we're not critically thinking? And I love when you're talking about the research, looking at it through this binary lens, like, is this true or is this not true? And when I think about, am I subscribing to something or not? Right. Like whether I'm opting in or opting out. Yes. When I feel really dogmatic and I feel really, it's actually hard for me to listen to people that are dogmatic because I'm just like, really? Like, it always feels like there is a yes and, like there's always a little bit more room or
nuance.
Yeah, there's always nuance, right? There's always a little bit something more, or I find it really hard when people might not say like, oh yeah, I don't really know actually. Like I want to learn from somebody that's more fluid, that isn't so binary. So it's like, how do I know when I'm not critically thinking? Yeah, I'm thinking about times where I've been in like social settings where I'm like, oh yeah, I'll agree with what you all are agreeing, right? There's like some social pressure, or when I am like, I don't have the time to sort through the research and I'm like, yeah, that sounds good. Right. So it's like, just, it feels like when I'm fast, rushed, feeling what's the word? Like pressure from a social group, or I am thinking very black and white. That's how I feel. That's how I know when I'm not critically thinking, versus if I'm going, oh, I love what she said there. Like that rings true with with, a variety of other resources that I've looked at. And I'm not sure about that, but I'd love to have a conversation about that. Right. Like when I'm a little bit more curious and not just jumping to a conclusion, I feel like that's when I'm more able to critically think.
Right.
So I'm like, I'm curious to hear like what are your thoughts in terms of like, when are you critically thinking and when are you not? Like, what does it feel like in you and what does it sound like?
I definitely agree with that. I have a mantra for myself: under education over states. And so if I am making big statements about something, or like broad generalizations, that's usually a red flag for myself. Like, I'm probably undereducated about this, because if I think that if I can make this sweeping generalization, then I'm probably missing a lot of information. So I'll stop myself.
Love that.
And I'll kind of prevaricate and I'll go, my current understanding is this thing, and I probably have a lot more to learn about this.
Okay, hold on a second. Right? This is why I freaking love Emily. And this is going to be a classic Marissa moment. What the hell does prevaricate mean? And I need to use that word now. What a fun word.
So prevarication is when you are being cautious in the statements that you're making. So you're like, I wouldn't make that claim that solidly. Let me kind of think of it as like a less like backpedaling, but with a more
I was just gonna say.
a more like backpedaling, but with a more positive connotation.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Like, well, actually, I'm actually not sure that that's super accurate. So take what I just said with a grain of salt, because there's a lot of assumptions going on there. Right.
Yeah. That's how I would have said it, but you have the actual word, which is way more cool to say.
Well, it's also more accurate, right? Because like I said, backpedaling has a negative connotation.
Right. It does.
That's not accurate to this process. Is an important and healthy process of kind of checking yourself and going, what actually, I don't know how I know that. I realized I just made the sweeping statement that I don't actually know where I got that information from. And that's healthy. Whereas backpedaling seems kind of slimy. Right?
Yeah. Backpedaling is like, I said something and then now I'm like taking it back.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I want to talk about some more practical examples of like critical thinking in your journey. I'll probably share some examples too, but sort of, walk us through like an example of where you stop to critically think about, I don't know, it could have been like a training modality. It could have been, when you were thinking about how you redesign, like not redesign, but you really, how you wrote your book on enrichment, right? Like there's a lot of, what does enrichment actually mean? Right. Like, and so I don't know, I'd love to hear just an example of how you have applied critical thinking in your own journey.
Yeah. So, for the book specifically, we started with a premise based on what we had already learned in the past from, wherever we learned it. And then, in the process of researching for the book, we said, how do we know that that's true? And so then we went and looked at research. And there were many things that we started off with when we started writing the book, basic premises, that when we did the research, we're like, that's not actually true. So we need to change this part of the book. So our original outline of the book looks pretty different from how the book actually turned out, because we started with a premise and then we dug into it. And then after we had done all of our research, I can't remember exactly, because another thing that I learned was that we were really disorganized in how we collected and kind of indexed our research. And so we I don't actually know how many papers we read, but it was in the hundreds. Um, and so we were writing as we were researching. And then when we finished our first draft, the second step of that was what we were jokingly calling a peer review process. It's obviously not real peer review because we didn't write a scientific paper, right? It wasn't academic literature. But we sent the first draft to several people, our mentors and people that we knew were a lot more knowledgeable than we were about, these different academic fields that are relevant to the book. And we said, all right, tell us what you got, right? Like, what do you see here? What, and so we got feedback from, there were a few people who were kind enough to read and provide feedback. And so then when we received that feedback, the next step was to look at the feedback and process. And that's where that metacognition comes in. A lot of the feedback was easy to take. And I don't know how much of that is just because I've been practicing this for several years, and how much of it was just because the feedback was like, oh yeah, that's incorrect, right? But there were some pieces of feedback I had emotions about, right? So for those, I really sat with them and I was like, okay, what's bothering me about this? Why am I having this emotion about this feedback? And then we were able to tease apart, okay, so in this case, the reason I'm having emotion about this feedback is because I learned this from a mentor that I really love and feel affection for, and I'm feeling defensive of her, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, I'm not willing to let her be human and be wrong and make mistakes. Okay, that's a valid emotion. It's coming from a good place of loving my mentor, but it's not serving me. So I accept this feedback and we will make these recommended changes. In other places, I was like, okay, the reason I'm having emotions about this feedback is because even though this is more accurate, we are trying to write to lay people, and this feels like it would be hard for lay people to swallow. Right. I don't want anybody to feel like we're talking over their heads. I don't want our book to make anybody feel like they're not smart enough to read it. And so that is, my emotions are valid and my objection is valid. So I hear what you're saying about this not being accurate. Can we find some kind of a compromise between what we're saying that's totally inaccurate and what you're saying, which is accurate, but ostracizing? Can we find a happy middle ground, right? And then there were other cases where I was like, okay, I'm having big feelings about this because the person who gave us this feedback has a selection bias where they're not seeing the audience that we are talking to, and so they don't think that this is relevant or important, but that's because they don't work with the audience that we work with. So I'm not going to make this change because I know that this is true. I know that people feel this way and have these experiences and need to hear this and need to think about this in this way. Just because that's not what you see in your profession doesn't mean that that's not our audience, right? And so in that case, I was like, thank you for your feedback. Not going to proceed with this, right? So the book is actually a good example of using those critical thinking skills, right? Because that whole process used all of those. It used identifying logical fallacies, identifying cognitive biases, epistemology, and metacognition. So yeah, thank you for bringing up the book, because in my head, when you were asking me this question, I was like, what example do I use? But that was a good example.
I mean, I figured the book, it sort of just came to me right now. I figured the book, and, for those of you that don't know, that the book that we're talking about, Canine Enrichment for the Real World, by Emily Strong and Ali Bender. And so if you don't have it, get it. It's amazing. And pretty much everyone I know has it. So I'm like, if you don't have it, definitely get it. I just thought that would be such a great example, because I know both you and Ali, like, you don't do anything half-assed, right? And you really wanted to put something out there. Like, I so appreciate that you really sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Like stood behind your intention of, we want this for a lay person. Like we want somebody to read this and feel really included and feel, and like see themselves providing or creating enrichment strategies and plans for their animals to make behavior change. Like I think that that's so great that you're like, no, that is something that we stand for, and we want to appeal to those people, but we want to do it in a really educated and thoughtful and critically thinking way. So I love that example. So thank you.
Thank you. That was helpful.
Yeah. I think of, there is an example that I had, and I'm sure since both of us have animal sheltering background, right? That's how I met Emily and Allie, actually, was through, and if folks don't know, the Shelter Playgroup Alliance, that is an organization that we were a part of in a variety of different ways. And the goal is to provide education to shelters, free education, I might add. So please go to shelterplaygroup.alliance.com. Really trying to build enrichment programs for shelter animals, and then also Lima-based playgroups. So that's where we originally met. And Mara Velez is the executive director, and Mara has been a mentor to both of us in a variety of ways. And I will never forget, like, I was taught when you were in a shelter how to do dog testing, right? So when I think about dog introductions, and whether you worked in a shelter or not, I feel like this is relevant, right? Because most of the time folks are just like ripping off the Band-Aid and walking two dogs towards one another. And like we would call it a dog test in the shelter, because you were evaluating how they responded to a dog that was approaching them. Even though you're really setting both dogs up for failure by just like ripping off the Band-Aid and being like, okay, let's see what happens. I'm going to walk dog A towards dog B, and we'll see. And
fast, direct approach while tethered with no means of escape.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for describing it. Like, now I'm sure everyone has a wonderful visual of that. And I will never forget, all the conversations Mara and I had where I was just like, no, that's how we do a dog test. Like, we want to push the dog over threshold slightly to like see what are they going to do when they're pushed over threshold, so that we feel safe enough to make a decision about whether we're placing them back out into the community. So much like that's what I was taught. That's what I taught people to do. Like, me personally taught people taught other shelters how to do it. And I was like, I don't know. I'm like really struggling with that. You're telling me that we could do it in a different way, that actually dogs don't even need to meet nose to nose in order to get a sense about how they would engage with another dog. And she was really patient with me. Like, I was just like, no, like, I really think, and we actually, it was great. She flew out here to Colorado, and we did a bunch of tests and dog introductions in a more humane way, with, making sure that both dogs are opting in or opting out, really defining, what does a dog test even mean? Like, even if a dog escalates during a dog test, does that mean that they're going to escalate in other contexts with other dogs in other environments? Like, no. Right. And so, man, she really helped shift. And again, she was really patient with me and was like, gently nudging me. And, I have come around, and I am working with a shelter right now that I taught the bad process to, like, in 2016. And they're like, oh, remember when you were on site and you taught us that awesome class about how to introduce dogs together? And I'm like, guys, I'm so embarrassed. Like, the way I would teach that to you now is so different. Right. And what you learned back then. Thank goodness they have staff turnover. So like, they're not doing that. They're actually, they're not doing that process, but that's just, when I was thinking about this episode, I was thinking about something that I really went from like No, I really believe we need to evaluate the dogs to understand like what behavior responses they're going to make. Because again, that's what we were taught in sheltering, right? Push, 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 behavior evaluation, behavior evaluation. And, it was through, and I think this is really important for listeners to hear, it was being around other people like yourself, like Keem, like Mara, like Allie, to go, or even, just like our whole group that we
The
were
whole
engaged
spa
with.
group. Yeah.
Yeah. Lisa Mullinax, like
Yeah.
everyone going like, well, wait, I do it differently. Or wait, what if we modified this element, for me to really go, wow, like these are people in the field that I really respect. And they've got a lot of research and experience to support. I think I need to up level my thinking about this, right? Like, I think like, why am I so married to this idea that this is how we quote unquote evaluate dogs, right? So,
Right.
when I think about a big shift for myself, I really think about that. And it was, one of the things I did right before I left Dumb Friends League was I taught the entire organization. Like there was 100 people that needed to go through this training because it hadn't been done. So like my last gift to Dumb Friends League was like teaching this new way. And I had Mara look over the process. So thank you, Mara. And I was like, oh, I'm so happy that like, that's what after 6 years of working there, I gave them tools that were more humane for the dogs. And with the feedback I got was like, oh, wow, like we're having fewer arguments, like surprise, right?
Right.
Go figure. So yeah, that's my example of where I'm, just sharing with our listeners that like we go through vulnerable processes, and like that's what makes growing and learning exciting. It's also uncomfortable, and yeah.
And I think what makes Mara such a good teacher, I mean, Mara's a good teacher for many, many reasons, right? But salient to this conversation, what makes Mara such a good teacher is that she's really proficient at saying that information that you have is incorrect. And also that's okay. And that doesn't mean that you don't have value and you aren't bringing value to the table, right? So essentially that initial spa summit where we all kind of gave a presentation, instead of her coming in and being like, all of that's wrong, here's the right way to do it, she's like, okay, so this part of what you're doing has value, we're going to include this, and this part of what you're doing has value, and what you're doing has value, and let's actually kind of compile our best practices and look at the things that we can improve on. And it's just a very matter of fact, unemotional process of like, we are all honing and refining our information, what we think we know. We're all coming to the table with some things that aren't best practices, and that's okay. It's not bad, it's not shameful, right? And like, even if we feel embarrassed about something, it's like, yeah, I mean, okay, feel what you feel. Your feelings are valid. If you feel embarrassed, so be it. But like, this process isn't embarrassing. This is just how we're going to develop a guideline for best practices, is by like critically evaluating what we all bring to the table, keeping the stuff that works really well and discarding the stuff that doesn't. And that is chef's kiss primo teaching, right? To just be able to say, you are carrying incorrect information and that doesn't make you a bad person. That's nothing to be ashamed about. Just let it go. Just let it go, and we'll replace it with something better.
Yeah.
Right. And that is critical thinking skills. That's how we should engage with critical thinking skills, is not thinking of it as like, you fell for this logical fallacy, you idiot. Right. Like that's not the point of it. Right. It's like, oh, okay, now that we know that this whatever logical fallacy or cognitive bias is going on, or maybe this is based on bad information, we did some epistemological sleuthing and found that it's kind of pseudoscience, we can just let it go and move on and do better, right? And that is such an important process, because for good reason, people do tend to conflate their learning process with embarrassment and shame and humiliation. And it's so much easier to just avoid and deny that than it is to embrace that And I think the point of critical thinking skills is you shouldn't have to embrace that. You shouldn't have to, you should be able to let go of that shame and embarrassment, because like, this is just what we all do. We're humans. We basically got a cranium full of jello and we're all bumping around the planet, like trying to figure things out.
Yeah.
That's just part of living. Right.
Yeah.
And it's okay.
Yeah.
Normalize being wrong, and normalize learning.
Yes.
And growing. Right.
And normalize the discomfort. Like, I appreciate, like in the beginning of the episode, like that we're confirming that learning is uncomfortable. And I think about, I have a mentor right now that is reviewing all my cases. And like, when she offers me feedback, I'm like, oh my gosh, Marissa, what is this 101? Like, how did you miss this? Right. And then and then she'll be like, hey, like there's, let's take a step back. You like, we don't need to like mock yourself because you're embarrassed or whatever. It's just like, this process is uncomfortable and we got to embrace discomfort. I don't know, like, because life is uncomfortable, whether that's learning or whether that's, engaging with a client and they're not satisfied with you, or whether it's that you are wrong or whatever it is, like life's uncomfortable. And so the faster that and I'm literally announcing this in a way to remind myself, no one else.
Right. We're talking to ourselves as much as anybody else.
Exactly. So it's like embracing discomfort is one of the skills that I work on all the time, because I'm so when everything is neat and organized and perfect, like I feel really good, and like this is just like literally not how life works. So so yeah. So embrace the discomfort, folks.
Yeah. Embrace being embarrassed. Embrace having those moments of like, oh my God, I'm so dumb. Right. Like, because we're humans. We bumble around.
Yeah.
We do embarrassing things. We make mistakes. We fall on our faces. Like, I can't remember where. I wish I could find it. I wish I had saved it, but somebody somewhere made a little like cartoon strip of like seeing humans from an alien's point of view, and it was like aliens talking about people the way we talk about animals, like, oh, look at him losing his keys, like how cute is that? Oh, look, they're upset with each other. And I was cracking up, and I was like, that's such a compassionate view of human behavior, of like, if we just look at ourselves as animals, like, of course, like how many dog videos do we like see where like the dog like is carrying a big stick and tries to come in the house and slams into the door, and we're like, oh my God, aren't you the cutest? Right.
Yeah.
So like, why can't we have that feeling about our own embarrassing mistakes when we like fall flat on our face and be like, oh my God, I just fell flat on my face in public. Right. Like,
you know what, we were just talking about this on Lima Beings. I want to bring it up here. Like, the moment when, and I'm pretty much any behavior professional that's listening is going to know this moment. And like, when I talk about this moment, I get chills. And, Matt Beisner and I talked a little bit about it on our podcast together, where it was like, it's like the moment the dog thinks about something and then makes a different choice, like this really small moment of recovery where they like look at something and then they disengage, or like they just make a different choice, and it like lights us up, right? Like we are like, you are the greatest thing in life. That was the greatest choice you could have ever made. It's like this small approximation, right? And we celebrate the shit out of that.
Right.
But we don't do that for ourselves, right? Like we don't. So instead of, if my mentor gives me feedback and I'm like, oh, Marissa, like, how could you have missed that? Right. What I've been doing more recently, I just started like a few days ago, where if I leave a hard situation, I'm like, Marissa, name 3 things that you did really well there. Because it's like, I want to start celebrating those little moments that that we see in dogs that we literally equate to magic. Like, would you agree? Right. When a dog makes a different choice, like, it's just like, it's like magic. And so it's like, Marissa, you are magical too, girl. Like, start to celebrate those little moments where Yeah. And it could be so tiny, right? Like it could be that I took a breath in the middle of a hard conversation, which I would probably argue that's not actually tiny. That is a big deal.
For me, that's not,
It's a big deal.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I just want to encourage folks like on this journey when it's uncomfortable, to like celebrate those little moments, those little approximations, because we're never going to arrive to this like perfect place. And so if that's when you're waiting to celebrate, like you are screwed, my friend.
Yeah. So I will tell you the reason I'm like big.
I know. Why are you grinning? Right. Yeah.
Is because whenever I do like kind of shift gears like that, I literally say out loud to myself, look at me making good life choices. Like that's what I say to myself out loud.
But that's exactly
those like shifts.
I love that. Like that's the oh my God, now I'm gonna think of you. That's the equivalent of like I mean, really, where we as like so many of my clients are like, oh, I love when you point out when my dog makes good choices. Like I know I'm saying that to my dog, like good choices, right? And so it's the equivalent. Like, look at you, Emily. You're making a good choice.
Good life choices.
You get a Zooey peek, and you get a Zooey peek, and you get a Zooey peek. It's like gonna Oprahing your way to bigger celebrations.
Yep.
I love it.
Yes. So that's how we can engage in critical thinking. So if you find yourself here's my like summary tip. If you find yourself like learning critical thinking skills and thinking now I can go out on the internet and point out how everybody's wrong better, that you're doing it wrong. Right?
You missed the episode.
Right. Remember that metacognition base, because really learning critical thinking skills is navigating the world in a way that makes it more comfortable to engage with the discomfort. Right?
Yeah. Love it. Thank you. Where can people find all your amazing programs and book and services online?
We are at petharmonytraining.com, all together, all lowercase, right? petharmonytraining.com. And pretty much everything is there. We also have a Facebook page, Instagram, Pinterest. I think those are all our social medias. I don't actually know because I don't do our social media as much as some of the other people on our team, but we can be found everywhere except like Twitter and TikTok, I think.
Yeah. Awesome.
Pet Harmony.
Petharmonytraining.com. We'll link to that in our show notes. And again, thank you for being on the show and for talking about such an important topic.
Yeah, it was fun. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah.
It's good to see you.
You too.